je suis Pierre-François, je suis le doyen de l'école de la recherche. Je vais dire un mot d'1 minute pour vous accueillir, pour vous dire que même si la rentrée veut dire que les vacances sont finies, et que donc c'est toujours intrinsèquement une mauvaise nouvelle, je suis très heureux de vous accueillir ici, chers étudiantes, chers étudiants. Il y a toute une équipe de profs, d'universitaires, de collègues qui sont là pour vous accueillir et pour vous dire que nous sommes heureux de vous accueillir. Nous avons la chance d'avoir une rentrée solennelle qui sera aujourd'hui organisée autour de la présentation d'Esther Duflo, qui nous fait l'amitié d'être avec nous ce soir, grâce à l'entremise, et je le remercie, de Pierre-Philippe Combe, le directeur des études doctorales en économie. Merci à toi, Pierre-Philippe. Un mot simplement pour vous dire qu'après cette réunion, il y aura des réunions beaucoup plus opérationnelles que vous aurez avec vos différents responsables de master et pour les doctorants avec Imola et moi-même. Et que nous vous proposerons par ailleurs un autre rendez-vous d'ici à la mi-octobre dans lequel nous vous présenterons plus généralement l'école, son projet et par ailleurs quelque chose qui peut vous intéresser directement, vos débouchés professionnels. Dans la session qui nous occupe, je vais commencer par donner la parole à Mathias Vichra, directeur de Sciences Po. Merci Mathias d'être avec nous cet après-midi. Ensuite, Sergueï Gouriev, le directeur de la formation et de la recherche de Sciences Po, interviendra. Et je dirai un très bref mot pour présenter Esther Duflo, et puis nous vous écouterons. Mathias.
Ne vous inquiétez pas, je ne serai pas long pour ne pas accaparer de précieuses minutes que nous laisserons à notre précieux invité. C'est assez chouette, je trouve, d'avoir cet amphithéâtre absolument bondé. On a l'impression qu'on est soit une réunion de l'UNEF, ça me rappelle mes anciennes années, soit un syndic de copropriété avec des sujets compliqués. Donc, pardon pour l'inconfort. Et en même temps, je trouve qu'il y a une dimension très chaleureuse. Donc, je suis mitigé par rapport à la situation. Si vous avez chaud, n'hésitez pas à enlever la veste. Je suis le seul en cravate avec Thierry. Bon, on va essayer de faire en sorte que les choses se passent bien. Chère Esther Duflo, monsieur le directeur de la recherche et de la formation et de la recherche, cher Sergueï, monsieur le doyen, cher Pierre, madame la directrice exécutive, chère Imola, et surtout, j'allais dire, chères étudiantes, chers étudiants, chères doctorantes, chers doctorants. C'est pour moi un immense plaisir d'être avec vous. Je n'aurais raté ce rendez-vous pour rien au monde. J'étais à Nancy ce matin avec un départ à 7h06 et un retour à 12h52. D'abord pour vous rencontrer, vous, doctorants, étudiants. Vous êtes 181 masterants et 60 nouveaux doctorants de cette promotion 2023 de l'école de la recherche. Bienvenue à celles et ceux qui viennent du collège universitaire. Vous êtes dans une forme de continuité après votre 3e année à l'étranger. Et bienvenue également aux 113 étudiantes et étudiants qui rejoignent Sciences Po pour la première fois. Nous avons veillé à vous sélectionner avec soin. Je dois dire que l'école de la recherche est très, très attractive, avec un taux de sélection très élevé. On ne peut que s'en féliciter. Je dois dire aussi que dans ma précipitation à revenir de Nancy, il y avait aussi la joie et l'honneur de pouvoir accueillir et d'entendre Esther Duflo. Vous le savez, je n'y reviens pas puisque Pierre pourra en parler plus longuement que moi. Esther Duflo est prix Nobel d'économie 2019, titulaire de la chaire Pauvreté et politique publique du Collège de France. Après une rentrée solennelle l'année dernière avec Philippe Descola, nous sommes très heureux d'accueillir Esther Duflo cette année. C'est un immense honneur pour nous que vous donniez le ton, d'une certaine manière, des prochaines années pour nos étudiants, nos doctorantes et nos doctorants de l'école de la recherche. Vous avez une approche à la fois multidimensionnelle de la pauvreté, une capacité à mêler des savoirs théoriques et une approche empirique, à penser au croisement des disciplines. Je ne serai pas beaucoup plus long, j'ai dit que c'était Pierre qui s'en chargeait. Mais vous avez, je trouve, quelque chose d'essentiel, une sorte de boussole, celle des fins et pas seulement des moyens, et j'aime particulièrement ce que vous avez déclaré il y a un an, je vous cite, « Je souhaite pratiquer l'économie comme une vraie science humaine, une science rigoureuse, impartiale, sérieuse. Une science de l'homme dans toute sa richesse et sa complexité, mais une science humaine, finalement, généreuse, ambitieuse, engagée. Vous ne cédez pas aux passions tristes, au temps avare, à l'hiver du monde. Cela me rappelle, dans une forme plus simplifiée, une formule qu'un de mes anciens patrons, qui d'ailleurs fait la leçon inaugurale demain de l'école du management et de l'impact, Emmanuel Faber prononçait « La finance doit être au service de l'économie doit être au service de la société ». Et si j'osais cette forme d'accaparement que nous avons tous et toutes à Sciences Po, on pourrait dire que votre façon de penser et d'agir a quelque chose en lien avec le projet de Sciences Po. C'est une forme d'atavisme, pardon, de tout ramener à nous, mais la pluridisciplinarité, le comparatisme, l'alliance de la pensée et de l'action, ce sens du bien commun sont parmi les principes fondateurs de Sciences Po il y a 151 ans, puisque, comme vous le savez, Sciences Po a été fondée en 1872 sur les ruines et sur les cendres de la guerre franco-prusse avec un nouveau projet universitaire qui était résumé notamment dans ces principes-là. Vous entrez, chers amis, dans une belle école, je l'ai dit, très attractive, très originale dans sa manière d'ancrer l'enseignement et la recherche au cœur du monde, au cœur des problématiques du monde. Et d'une certaine manière, ce que nous souhaitons, c'est vous accompagner, vous donner les clés dans vos recherches, dans vos ambitions. L'ambition académique de Sciences Po est développée depuis plusieurs années, et bien que non titulaire d'un doctorat, moi, je pense devoir accompagner l'académisation, la refondamentalisation de Sciences Po, avec Sergueï Gouriev, avec toutes les équipes, pour faire en sorte que l'université internationale que nous souhaitons, que nous sommes d'ores et déjà, que nous souhaitons encore développer, puisse être pleinement effective. J'ai pris l'engagement d'augmenter de 30% la faculté permanente de Sciences Po. 30 postes ont déjà été créés depuis mon arrivée. Un doublement du nombre de contrats doctoraux et FNSP, et puis de nouveaux leviers de financement. Je pense notamment à la création de 10 postes doc sur le fonds Latour, avec une levée de fonds à la fois privée et publique, sur les problématiques de transformation environnementale. Bref, nous avons une ambition d'académisation de Sciences Po extrêmement importante. Chères étudiantes, chers doctorantes, chers doctorants, évidemment, votre vie va commencer à être très intense sur le plan académique, intellectuel, et j'allais dire du travail, à partir de lundi. À partir de lundi, les choses sérieuses commencent. Mais il ne faut pas que votre vie à Sciences Po se résume à cela. Sciences Po, c'est aussi une forme d'expérience, des échanges, toute une série de conférences, des associations multiples dans tous les domaines. Et donc, si je ne vous invite pas à vous égayer au Basile ou à vous disperser par rapport à votre stratégie et à votre but, qui est finalement de poursuivre des recherches de manière efficace et sérieuse, Sciences Po, c'est plus que des études, c'est plus que de la recherche, et je vous invite toutes et tous, notamment celles et ceux, les 113, qui ne viennent pas de Sciences Po, à profiter de cet écosystème. Je ne serai pas plus long. Chère Esther Duflo, chers amis, merci beaucoup, et que cette année soit douce, laborieuse, et surtout que vous connaissiez le bonheur, chacune et chacun. Merci beaucoup.
Dear Director of Sciences Po, dear Matthias, dear invited speaker, dear Esther, dear Dean of the School of Research, dear Pierre, dear Director, Executive Director, dear Mala, dear Directors of Graduate Studies in 4 disciplines, Thierry, Marion, Jérôme, and Pierre-Philippe, and most of all, dear Master and Doctorate students. Sciences Po has many rentrées solennelles, and each time we say this is the most important rentrée solennelle because this is the most important school of Sciences Po. This time, I mean it. This time I really mean it. Because, not because I'm just a researcher or I was myself a director of graduate studies in economics or because I'm a vice president of research in Sciences Po, but because training new researchers is key, is essential to our mission as an institution. If you look at our website, you will see that we call ourselves an international research university. Sciences Po is an unusual research university. We do have many more professors who are professionals, practitioners, rather than academics, compared to other universities. And this is great. We are not an ivory tower, and we don't want to be an ivory tower. Our motto is to understand the world, to make a difference. And we do make a difference through training new generations of leaders for public and private sector, for NGOs, for international organizations, for providing policy advice to governments and businesses. But let me also emphasize that in order to make a difference, or at least to make a right difference, the right difference, we need to understand the world. And this is natural. As we are facing new multiple crises of global scale, we need ideas to solve the crisis. Some people would say that ideas that come from research, from researchers, are too abstract, and we need to use down-to-earth wisdom of practitioners rather than academics. But as one of the founders of modern economics, Keynes, once said, I quote, "Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist." as someone who's worked very closely with practitioners, policymakers, myself, I can assure you that this is exactly true, even though Keynes is now a defunct economist himself. Indeed, both in public and private sector, leaders base their decisions on ideas that they learn in school, in elite universities themselves. Sometimes that happens decades before they become leaders, and so some of this stuff has to be unlearned. Sometimes they read recent books of researchers. Sometimes they get ideas and solutions from their advisors who themselves talk to researchers, read applied research papers or op-eds, or journalists who talk to researchers. So eventually, Keynes is right in the sense that there is not another source of new ideas, or at least new good ideas, other than research. And as you will see during your studies, the academic world is structured in the way that new research, recent research, that you're going to study and do yourself, is usually better, more rigorous, and more relevant. So if the suspicion that academic research is impractical is incorrect, let me actually say a few words about the criticisms from the other side. Sometimes you can hear from researchers that academics should do pure research, and that research that has practical implication is not pure, is second-rate. And this is, of course, also wrong. And this is where our guest speaker, our invited speaker, Esther Duflo, is a best illustration of. So Esther still has a stellar academic career, and it is stellar not despite, but because her work has always been directly relevant and applicable to lives of people around the world. She has run tens, if not hundreds, of field experiments in developing countries. She has co-founded a Poverty Action Lab, JPAL, Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab. I emphasize action here. And she has changed dramatically the way development practitioners work and function around the world. And it is for this work, for this research, she was awarded the Nobel Prize to become the youngest economist ever to receive it. Esther will tell you more how good social science can help us solve the most important crisis of our times, the climate change crisis. But let me quickly give you some other examples that show how research, and research in social science in particular, helps us improve the world. In 1939, the founder of Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, Abraham Flexner, wrote a famous article, Usefulness of Useless Knowledge. In that article, he was explaining how the important technological, industrial innovations and inventions of that time were actually driven by and were inevitable because of prior fundamental research in physics, chemistry, and math. By now, it's conventional wisdom that research in natural sciences, which may sound abstract and useless at first, can bring enormous tangible benefits to the humanity. But it's also the case for the social sciences, not just natural sciences, and it is especially true in the 21st century. And you are too young to remember the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, but that was the biggest global recession since 1930s. And at that time, the world was afraid of replaying the Great Depression of 1930s. But what researchers have done, they've studied the Great Depression, and they understood that part of the reason why this depression was so long and deep was that the world leaders were caught in the protectionist trap. They embarked on beggar thy neighbor policies, and therefore aggravated the impact of the crisis. That was not the case in 2009, 2010, when G20 leaders got together, learned from this research, and actually kept the trade borders open. On the other hand, while avoiding this mistake, we unfortunately made another mistake, the fiscal austerity policies, and that led to second recession in Europe and provided fertile ground for the rise of populism. Luckily, we studied this as well. We understood this issue, and we learned from this mistake. So 10 years later, in 2020, the academic consensus helped European leaders quickly make the right decision and embark on a much more generous fiscal response to the COVID crisis, including the creation of unprecedented Next Generation EU program. Another big contributor to the rise of populism is disconnect between elites and ordinary people. Modern politicians face so-called paradox of democratic leader, where they have to be competent and connected to the voters at the same time. It's very hard. And that's why we see that people study a lot to become political leaders. They need to know a lot of stuff. At the same time, if you study and work only in politics, you become detached. And so that creates this gap between very educated, very professional technocratic elites and ordinary people. How to reestablish the connection, how to avoid providing these opportunities for populists? Well, political scientists have come up with a solution called deliberative democracy. And it's not an abstract idea anymore. In the last decades, we've actually seen deliberative democracy, citizens' assemblies, citizens' conventions, like it's called in France, Conference on Future of Europe. It's 300 deliberative democracy experiments have been run in OECD countries in the last 30 years. Some work well, some less well, but each time we study them, and these are the researchers who actually try to make them more efficient. Another great challenge of our times, especially in the US, is political polarization. So can political science offer a solution there? Well, one of the theoretical ideas that voting theorists have studied for decades is ranked choice voting. And again, we could say it's just a set of formulas, it's a theory, but it's not the case because the time for this idea has come and it's now being rolled out in several states and cities in the United States, which actually helps to prevent the situation where your choice is between extreme left and extreme right. It actually creates an opportunity to select political leaders that belong to the center and may not be as loved by the extremes, but at least are not as bad as the other extreme. Finally, I would just mention the other crisis, which is the spread of disinformation on social media. In 2016, the world has learned the disastrous potential political and social implications of this. And since then, many social scientists have studied this, have understood how false news emerge and circulate on social media, and which interventions, which policies can be used to slow down misinformation and disinformation. This also has very direct practical implications. We now see the cooperation between governments, social media, fact-checking organizations around the world, and most importantly here in Europe, we have a very practical and important piece of legislation called Digital Services Act, DSA. And again, in real time, researchers who work on this inform policymakers and regulators how to implement it in the most efficient way. I could go on forever, but as I said, we have a much better speaker on the issue of importance of research on solving the most important challenge of our time. So let me once again congratulate you on starting your journey in the School of Research of Sciences Po and make one wish. I hope, and I think it's perfectly realistic, and we'll work on that, that in 30 years, one of you will stand here and like Esther today, will tell the new students how his or her excellent research has helped to make our world a better place. Thank you.
D'un mot réellement, et ce ne sera pas compliqué puisque l'essentiel a été dit. Je souhaitais dire un mot pour vous présenter, chère Esther Duflo, en rappelant que vous avez été formée à l'ENS et au MIT. Vous avez soutenu votre thèse à la fin des années 90. Vous avez depuis poursuivi votre carrière dans cette université. Et depuis un an, vous êtes professeure au Collège de France. Vos travaux ont reçu de nombreux prix, en particulier en 2019 le prix Nobel d'économie. Vos travaux, je me permettrai juste de signaler effectivement ce qui les singularise peut-être, en tout cas pour quelqu'un d'extérieur à la discipline, pardonnez l'épaisseur du grain. Vos travaux d'abord se caractérisent par le champ que vous étudiez, l'économie du développement et de la pauvreté. Et il se singularise également par le recours à une méthode particulière consistant à procéder à ce qu'on appelle en français parfois des expérimentations aléatoires. Le principe consistant, vous le savez certainement, à diviser une population en deux groupes comparables et à prendre la mesure de l'effet d'un dispositif de politique publique, par exemple, en l'activant dans une population, en ne l'activant pas dans l'autre population et en comparant le devenir de ces deux groupes. Un mot peut-être, simplement pour expliquer pourquoi nous sommes particulièrement heureux de vous accueillir ici aujourd'hui, parce que, me semble-t-il, vous êtes en quelque sorte à la croisée d'une tension que tous nos étudiantes et toutes nos étudiantes et tous nos étudiants vont connaître, qui est la tension entre la nécessité d'avoir une excellence disciplinaire, et donc d'être véritablement inscrit dans un champ disciplinaire, et en même temps la volonté, la tentation le désir de rentrer dans un dialogue interdisciplinaire, comme le rappelait tout à l'heure Mathias. Et c'est pour cette raison, me semble-t-il, que lorsque nous avons commencé à évoquer les speakers que nous pourrions inviter pour cette rentrée solennelle, il n'y a eu, c'est l'une des raisons qui a fait qu'il n'y a eu absolument aucun débat entre les représentants des 5 disciplines de Sciences Po, d'inviter quelqu'un qui était un représentant éminent, évidemment, de l'une de ces disciplines et qui en même temps avait chevillé au cœur dans son travail la volonté de construire un dialogue interdisciplinaire. Merci beaucoup, chère Esther Duflo. Je vous donne maintenant la parole.
Il faut juste que je puisse accéder. Ah, c'est vous qui accédez. Ok. Je parle en français ou en anglais? Ah, mais j'ai un cliqueur. Ça, c'était ma première question. Ma deuxième question, je parle en français ou en anglais? English is possible. English. Great. Then that's good because my slides are in English. So, first of all, welcome to your first day. That must be pretty exciting, especially for people who are starting masters or a PhD. It's an exciting time, and there'll be ups and downs. Through the downs, remember there is a light at the end of this tunnel, and it's pretty cool. What I want to talk to you today actually is not so much about randomized controlled trials, although it's going to come incidentally. I want to talk about the climate change, and unfortunately, I'm not going to talk much about how to mitigate climate change. I want to talk about the impact of climate change on developing countries, on the low and middle income countries where most of my work is located. And then I want to talk about what this implies for the responsibility of rich countries and rich countries' citizens, and really rich citizens of the world, not necessarily those who live in rich countries, and what we should do about that. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that a lot of the discourse about what rich countries should... So a few weeks ago, John Kerry, who is the envoy for climate change for the US, declared in front of the Congress in the US that the US will never, ever pay reparations for climate change. So at least we know where we're starting from. I think this is true. This is not going to happen. It's not going to happen for any number of reasons. One of them being that I think if we start entering the language of reparations, there is so much the US and Europe has to atone for that I think it would be very scary to get into that. So in a sense, whatever we individually think about the historic responsibility for climate change, which are undoubtedly in the development path chosen by, undertaken by our ancestors, I think we can let that aside and think about what is happening today. And of course, what is happening today is that even today, the emissions responsible for climate change are mainly due to the behavior of rich country citizens. So of course, we kind of know that at some level, but quickly there is, usually once you have said that, there is a next sentence that, oh well, but China and India, they really produce a lot of CO2 equivalent, which is correct. But a lot of what is being produced in India, in China in particular, and India to a large extent as well, is in the service of a production of goods and services that we are consuming in our countries. So when you try to define what's someone's carbon footprint, there really are different notions. The most basic one, easiest to compute, is the point of use. So if you're driving your car, you need to put oil in it. That creates emission. The second is to add electricity use. And the third is to add the emissions that are linked to the production of, say, the car that you are driving. So even when we are buying something like a TV, which has been produced in China, the emissions were produced in China, but the carbon footprint by this third measure belongs to us. Now, the difficulty is that when you want to, it's pretty hard to compute this measure. It really cannot be done easily at the individual level because it would require knowing what everybody is consuming and where it was produced and so on. But what we do know, what we can do is to use a trade table to look at what is the composition of you're looking at the trade flows, whether most goods are imported or exported, and therefore we get a sense of whether countries overall are exporters or importers of emissions. And China and India are net CO2 exporters because a lot of what they produce is being exported in other countries, and the US is a huge importer. So the question is, so we cannot, it's hard to estimate. What we would love to have in order to kind of measure a global distribution of carbon footprint is to have, maybe a census or even a very large survey of what people consume, where it was produced, and therefore what's the total carbon footprint. But it's hard to do. So, but what people have done instead, and in particular Lucas Chancel, who is here now, and Bruckner, in parallel independent work at the World Bank, so it's good to mention that because the results are very, very similar. They both make assumptions that you can quibble with, but since they are different assumptions, it's pretty encouraging that we are ending up in the same ballpark, at least conceptually. And so the first thing you do is you estimate survey data to estimate the elasticity of emission with respect to income by looking at consumption data for whatever survey we have, relate this consumption data to the input-output data in trade, and then from there estimate the emission related to the consumption, run a regression that tells you roughly the elasticity of emission with respect to income is about 0.5. So it's people as they become richer don't consume proportionally. It's not saying the rich emit less than the poor. It's saying they emit more, but in a somewhat decreasing pattern. But still, it's pretty high elasticity, which means that as people become very much richer, they emit much more. We've seen that, when last year in particular, much less this year, but last year there was all this discussion about jets and so on. So that's the extreme version of that: jet, yacht, swimming pool. But this is more generalized. That the richer you are, the more you buy, the more you emit. So when you combine this elasticity with data on global distribution of revenues around the world, you can compute the distribution of carbon footprint. So the way Chancel does it is to combine it with the World Inequality database. The way Bruckner done it is to combine it with databases at the World Bank. And the data summarizes itself nicely because it gives you this 10-50 rule, which works both ways, which is quite magical, which is if you rank people by how much they emit, of course, because which reflects directly the global inequality in consumption pattern and income pattern around the world, the 10% highest polluter worldwide are responsible for almost 50% of global emission. And conveniently, the bottom 50% is responsible for about 10% of global emission. These things didn't have to work symmetrically. In fact, they're not quite. You're seeing that it's actually the top 10% are responsible for 48%, if I read my slide right, where the bottom 50% are responsible for 11 or so. But you can remember 10-50. When we put this, in a map, you get this. This was actually from Bruckner, but you could get, because the illustration was nicer, but the result is the same. You're looking at where all of these people are around the world, and although they are rich people in China and they are rich people in India, it turns out that the high polluter tend to live mainly in richer countries, in particular in the US, because also people at any level of income in the US emit more than people in Europe. And there's one place where they certainly don't live is Africa. Over time, similarly, in the last several decades, there is a kind of analogous of the elephant curve that we are seeing in inequality data, that we are also seeing in pollution data, that the vast majority of the growth of emission by decile of emission is for the top deciles. Once we have that, we can start playing with some experiment. This is from Bruckner, who is asking, for example, well, suppose that we manage to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So suppose that every African now had a consumption level of more than $2.15 per person and per day at PPP. Would that contribute to emission a lot? And we're seeing that it wouldn't, because they are consuming so little, emitting so little as of today, that if you eradicate extreme poverty completely, you would increase emission by only 2%. So the first thing to note is there really is no trade-off between the poorest country in the world eradicating extreme poverty, achieving a basic, decent human standard of living, and fighting climate change. And that should be pretty obvious, especially coming from speaking from Paris or from Washington, D.C., but it's not. Often you kind of still go back and say, well, they should avoid to make the mistake we made, and so on and so forth. Well, suppose that at least they would get to the SDG minimum, that would really contribute nothing to climate change. That's the first point. So we have a problem that is mainly a problem of caused by people in rich countries, and mainly, of course, by the richest people of rich countries, but mostly by people in rich countries. But the cost of climate change, although it's not that we are going to experience no cost of climate change, it's good to remind ourselves that it's coming for us too. But first order, in terms of the magnitude and the importance, the cost of climate change, in terms of human lives, are going to be order of magnitudes greater in the poorest part of the world. And that's for two reasons. One of them is purely mechanical, is that the poor countries tend to be in places that are already warm. So if the planet, of course, the global warming is not going quite uniform in each pixel of the planet, but suppose it was, then in a place that tends to have a lot of hot days anyway, so this is average temperature, and you can see the heat map of the heat. It's already quite hot in the Sahel region of Africa, in the north of India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, etc., where a lot of poor people live. So over time, if the planet, say, heats up by 2 degrees, you're going to have more of the very hot days in places that already have days that are almost very hot. So by 2050, most of the places that will get, so this is a heat map of the number of days above 32 degrees Celsius, which, as you would recognize from last week, wherever you were, if you were in France in particular, becomes uncomfortable and in fact not compatible with normal human activities, 32 degrees or 35 degrees. And you can see that by 2050, there is going to be a lot of those in Africa, a large increase of those days in Africa and in Latin America. By 2100, it's going to be even more. And you're not going to see much more of those extremely hot days in Sweden or even in the US. There'll be some. We saw some in Phoenix, Arizona, for example, but not as many. That's the first point. It's kind of silly point, but we should really remind ourselves. The simple impact in terms of number of days that are not conducive to human life are going to be different in Punjab and in Bourgogne. The second thing is that the impact of a hot day on human life, and here I'm not talking at all about the various damages, floods and stuff like that, just the heat. That same exercise could be repeated for those extreme events. But put the extreme events aside. By the way, the extreme events might be more of a problem for richer countries than the heat itself. But if you really focus on the heat, which I think we understand better, what is going to happen to the heat, the impact of this number of very hot days, we can get a sense about that by looking at what happened historically. So the climate change hasn't happened yet, or it's kind of happening, but what has happened for sure for decades is variation in weather from year to year and places to places. So if we are not looking at the effect of extreme event, but the effect of hotter or cooler temperature, we can compare, for example, within a geography, you take India, and you can compare over time what happens to mortality, say, in districts of India that experience more days above 32 degrees centigrade compared to fewer in a particular year. So for the moment of jargon, you can put fixed effects for the district, you can put fixed effects for the year, and you can say, well, that particular district is particularly hot. Did anybody die? How many? So this has been done first in some settings in the US, in India, in other countries, and then it's been done quite systematically by a group led by Michael Kremer, which put together as much data as they could from about weather changes and related to mortality changes historically in as many regions as they could. And what you find, so this what's on the sides, in the little graphs here on the side panel are looking at the impact of a relatively warm day. You can see the number of the temperature, the average temperature compared to less hot temperature. So the number of days where it gets very, very hot in different type of regions. So you have the countries that are rich, poor, or middle income, and you have the countries that are cold, temperate, or hot. So what you see when you compare, how much, so what's interesting in this graph is how much of an increase in, so these are all the effect of the weather of the number of days at this particular heat on mortality. So what is of interest is how much of a hockey stick you get. Like, do you get a lot of increase in mortality at at high temperature? So there are two things that come back from inspecting these curves. The first one is that in places that are traditionally cold, regardless of the income level, when it gets very, very hot, a lot of people die. Why? It's because if it gets very hot in Sweden, it's not that they have air conditioning, so people are not prepared. And then, remember probably not, many of you are not even old enough to remember, but the oldest among you can remember 2003 canicule in Paris. And all these old people died because nobody was prepared. And in subsequent canicule, it was much less the case because we kind of know what to do. There are places where people can go. You know that you are supposed to call your grandmother and so on. So as people are not used to hot temperature, they don't adapt. So that's sad for them. But on the other hand, it's okay because they'll get fewer of those days. The second thing you can see from looking at these graphs is that as countries become richer, those hockey stick things are less high. So say you look at the temperate countries, the low-income temperate countries have an increase in hockey stick at high temperature that is as high as the high-income cold country. On the other hand, if you take a country that is temperate but high income, there is very little increase at the top. And if it's hot with high income, like Saudi Arabia, for example, you see basically no impact of hot temperature. Everyone has air conditioning, they are prepared. So income is very protective. Experience is very protective, and income is very protective because we adapt. We can spend money. Of course, air conditioning is a big way in which people adapt, but also the fact that people in poor countries are more likely to be working outside construction sites or in fields, and people in rich countries are more likely to be working in offices that can be kept cooler or air conditioned. The consequence of taking this, combining them together, is this map here, which is another heat map saying, well, this is the impact of an extra day at 35 degrees in this particular pixel. So that map is actually, it's extrapolated. They have less data than that, but it looks pretty good. And you can see that a given day, a given hot day would kill people, a lot of people in Alaska if it happened, but there are not very many of them will happen, or in Russia. But it will also kill a lot of people in Madagascar, in the Sahel region of Africa, in Pakistan. So when we combine the two, the fact that by 2100 there will be more hot days in the poor countries, and it will be harder to adjust to any given hot day, you get this resulting map, which has the mortality cost of basically a business as usual scenario of emission by 2100, and you're getting this thing that basically the big increase in mortality will be in Africa, in Pakistan, a little bit in Latin America. And meanwhile, France will tend to have a decrease in mortality. It's not saying people will not die of canicule, but fewer people will die during the winter. It's not saying we shouldn't be worried about climate change, because there are other problems with climate change other than the heat itself. But it's to say that just as an order of magnitude, this is not the same ballpark even. So this unfortunately makes for, so just in terms of how much we are talking about, I might have these slides later, but I'm not sure, so I'll make sure to say it. The increase in mortality that is estimated by these models give you a number of 73 extra deaths per 100,000 people. That doesn't sound so much until you see that it's larger than all of the deaths of infectious diseases today. So it's like we will kill as much people with heat as are dying today from tuberculosis, malaria, or HIV. And all of these deaths will happen outside of the OECD. So this makes for thorny political issues because, first order, in the next many years, the problems are going to be in the south, but the principal margin of actions, which is reducing the emissions, are in the north. So have we displayed a great capacity of action, collective action, we, the world, to deal with such problems? I wouldn't think so. In particular, the COVID experience suggests that we are not very good at sharing solutions to problems. The slide should say we are pretty good at sharing problems. We are not as good at sharing solutions to problems. I'll say I'll just mention briefly two axes of that. The first one is the fiscal stimulus response that Sergei mentioned. Rich countries spend 27% of their GDP in fiscal stimulus measures during the COVID crisis, which was pretty instrumental in making sure that poverty didn't increase in a lot of in the EU or even in the US, and that probably was responsible for a relatively fast restart of the economy. Meanwhile, in the poorest countries, they spend 2% of their GDP on fiscal stimulus measure. Mind you, not because they didn't think it would be a good idea, but they just didn't have the money. Whatever it takes is something you can say and implement if you have the ability to borrow at the time at pretty much zero interest rate, and people will lend you, but that doesn't work if you're Togo. even if you have a great idea for a cash transfer for your citizens. It would have been rounding error in the trillions that we were raising, rightly so, I should add, to our citizens to bring the poorest country to 27% of their own GDP, because their own GDP is really not that big. But there was no, the increase in financial flow to the poor country hardly registered. It was not nothing, but it was very, very, very low compared to the increase what we were doing, which is reflected in this 2%. The consequence of that was that there was a lot of things that kind of went south during the COVID crisis for the poor countries. Businesses stopped, etc. They really had problems restarting their economies, unlike us. And then, of course, we got the other crisis that added to it, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then the interest rate increase, which I've talked about in a minute. But before that second example, we probably forgot that episode now. But the first vaccines arrived in Europe in March. This graph is from many, many months later, not now, not currently, and showing that the rate of vaccination was so unequal for months and months and months during the pandemic. The international effort was created with the creation of a fund to buy vaccines, and then the richer country promptly proceeded to hog all of the available supplies, and which meant that this fund couldn't even buy the doses. So it's not their fault. They just, it was not available. And it took a really long time until there was really an excess supply of vaccine flooding our markets, that the vaccines made their way to the developing countries. At the time, I wrote before a G20 summit, the IMF, the World Bank, everyone became super worked up that we need to do something about this problem. I wrote an op-ed suggesting that this is a really easy problem relative to climate change. So if only we could demonstrate the enough leadership of richer countries to share vaccines, which is pretty not very difficult thing to do, then that would create goodwill that will become really important later when we need to collaborate on other topic. I didn't know about Ukraine at the time, but that would have been an example. And then nothing happened, which is, I think, powerfully demonstrated the fact that the richer countries were not ready to share solutions to problems. Of course, we are good at sharing problem. Another way in which we are sharing problem is interest rate. In order to fight our inflation on our soil, interest rates have increased, the dollar has increased, which has led to a debt crisis in many countries. About 60 countries are either in debt crisis or very close to it, which is another way. And then, it's like one by one, some solution is worked up very, very slowly. So that to say that we are not at the moment displaying great talent for international leadership to help countries face with the problems that are really of our making, which makes me a little worried about whether we can count on collective action to help the low and people living in low and middle income countries deal with the problems related to climate change. So where are we after many COPs? Somewhat unfair characterization. The first one is that there is just not enough money flowing towards low and middle income countries. The commitments are too weak, and they are not carried out or renewed. So there is a 100 billion pledge that was never fulfilled. Much of this money, in any case, is spent on mitigation. So it's giving money to country to do things that are going to reduce climate change, which is kind of to help us out. And very little is spent on adaptation or loss and recovery. the COP27 has a loss and damage fund, that's a progress, but it doesn't have any financing plan attached to it. And as far as I can tell, there is no money in that fund as yet. And then on top of that, there is kind of a reliance on technological solutions to continue as much as possible with an intact lifestyle fueled in a carbon neutral way. So that's kind of what we hope to achieve with a kind of magical thinking reliance on ESG fund to get this all organized. ESG being environmental, social governance fund in enterprise. So in view of this kind of context, let me offer some reflection. The first one is we cannot tackle climate change without tackling redistribution across countries, both because of what I explained and that the structure of the problem, that today the emissions are mainly in the north, the impacts are mainly in the south, and people know that, countries know that. But also because of these graphs, I showed you that in the absence of adaptation fund, becoming richer as fast as possible is the only path that many countries see to protect themselves. You take a country like India, which is basically on both ends of the problem. It's both a contributor to climate change because it's so big and it uses so much charcoal, and it is facing the consequence of climate change because it's very hot and has a lot of poor people. The energy need of India will become tremendous with hotter temperature. A lot of people are air conditioning. More people will get it as they age. So developing the energy that is the cheapest today will remain a priority for India for the foreseeable future. And it's been their official position. This is the electricity need of the poor countries, and it will be from now till 2100. The middle-income country will need lots and lots of energy to adapt to climate change, and we'll want it in the cheapest way possible. So you probably don't remember the Glasgow conference, but there was a very depressing moment in the Glasgow COP conference where at the very, 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 very end, India, basically, which was going to sign a pledge to to get away from charcoal, finally did not sign that, and the pledge was a much, much weaker pledge. And it is very unfortunate, but it's kind of make clear. Then it made the argument, it's pretty hard to contest. It's like, come on, like, what are we going to do? We do need cheap energy to adapt to the hotter temperature. So unless you can help us finance something else, then we cannot do it. Another example is Ecuador. So they were trying to get money from international money to basically pay them to curb drilling in the Amazon, but they couldn't get anybody to buy those bonds. They didn't, and so they just started to drill. So that's the first point, is that in a sense, so another example, which is a somewhat older example, is the Kigali Agreement on air conditioning. So there was an agreement in Kigali years ago on air conditioning. So the air conditioning is, of course, part of the solution and part of the problem. It's even more part of the problem with the old air conditioning machine, which have fluor in them, which is terribly polluting, and the newer, the ones you have in your house, if you've installed the house recently, are much less bad. In the Kigali Declaration, China and India managed to get the concession that they wouldn't need to replace the bad air conditioning with the good ones until 2024. That means that until 2024, hundreds of thousands of the bad air conditioning are flooding China and India, and Kigali was now, I don't know, 2015 or something like that. When, the other technology exists, it's just a matter of money. Like, how stupid can it be to not get them the money? Because once you have an old air conditioning machine, that will live for a long time. So this is really something where, you can see that the money is also necessary for adaptation. So the second point is it's going to be hard to tackle climate change without tackling redistribution within country. We saw it during the Gilets jaunes. If you're not French, you might not know that what prompted the Gilets jaunes movement was an effort to have a carbon tax on oil. It went away after 2 days, so after that there was other grievances came in, but it shows that's an issue in the richer countries. So the Gilets says the money for climate change is in fiscal paradise, not in the pocket of the proletariat. But we have very similar dynamics playing out in poor countries as well. For example, in Punjab, in India, farmers get free electricity, which they use to pump water to irrigate rice fields, which, number one, you use a lot of electricity. Number two, you take all the water from the ground, which is not very good for the environment, regardless of climate change. Number three, the rice stalk is being burned, which creates huge amount of black particle matter, which choke Delhi and are also responsible for climate change. It would seem that the simplest thing would be to pay farmers to stop doing rice, or at least to use less electricity. But it's been absolutely impossible to do politically because farmers do not trust it. Farmers do not think that the government is going to really believe that it's happening, and so this is something that doesn't work. So in other words, I think to make this a solution for climate change, for both adaptation, mitigation, and loss and recovery work, the world will need to commit now to a mechanism to raise money for a fund, like the loss and damage fund, which would be designed to low-income countries, low-income citizens, which is fair, which is permanent, so it doesn't rely on periodic renegotiation. You just need a mechanism. And ideally, it provides some incentives along the way to reduce pollution emissions, which of course would be the first best. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I want to kind of outline it very briefly. The first step is how much money is needed. So from the papers that I described, you can show that you can get an estimate of about that each ton of carbon emitted costs $37 just in human life, mostly or exclusively in developing countries. So you take this $37, you're adding up the consumption emission from consumption in US and Europe, you get a total of 14 billion tons per year, which is a mortality cost of about $500 billion per year in poor countries. Just for comparison, US foreign aid is $56 billion. So just to put in perspective the amount of money that's needed, it's got nothing to do with the budget of cooperation. This is much more money. In my mind, this is the money we owe, the rich world owe. So unfortunately, that's a lot. So I don't know that we can raise that much, but this is how much we would need. And then how would we raise it? Well, I'm going to look at two things. First, would we raise $500 billion a year, which is that number, or $100 billion a year, which would be the previous commitment that we had. A number of options have been discussed. Some of them were discussed in Paris during the Macron summit. I'm not going to go on these various tools. I'm going to suggest one tool, which seems to have some measure of possible realism. I'm not saying it will happen, but it's not crazy to think that it could happen. Because thanks to the effort of the OECD and all the various administrations, including the French one and the US one, the world have already agreed to a minimum taxation of large international corporations of 15% minimum tax. This money is currently raised by countries and then they keep it. So we cannot take that money away, but you could say, well, let's add a little bit of, a few percentages to it. If you added 3% to it, according to the calculation in Zuckman's center, he has a nifty little tool that you can see. If you went from 15 to 18, you could get about 300 extra billion euro, or 5% you get 431 billion euro compared to what the 15% status quo would raise. It doesn't seem that much because a 20% corporate tax is already lower than what we have in France. So it's not like, first of all, it wouldn't even affect us. So that's something that France should be able to get behind. So it's not insane. It's in the ballpark of something. And that would raise the money we want. Some fraction of that, of course, any 1% would be about 300, would be about 100. So that would go some part of the way. Of course, it might, not work. Even the agreement itself might not work. In the US, it required congressional approval, which is very likely to come. But, one could do partial things. Like Europe could do it alone, for example, and then compensate itself by some form of tariffs. Another drawback of this particular mechanism is that, of course, it's money, but money doesn't compensate really for human life. It doesn't. There's no explicit connection to the greenhouse gas emissions. One way to do it is to connect it to climate change. Is once we have a better accounting of carbon footprint of company, then you could, of course, relate, you can give rebate to that as a function of actual real carbon footprint, not taking into account the greenwashing commitment and so on from their actual activities. Of course, it might be very difficult for countries to agree to levy tax on behalf of other people, but, this is maybe it could be possible. So the next question, step 3, is how you would spend that money if you could raise it. So there are several extremes. There is the Piketty proposal on one end to say any money that's being raised through any mechanism should be just given straight directly to people from this country in the form of to the government of these countries. For them to do whatever they want, it's their money. At the other extreme, you have, any institution that is in the business of doing stuff wants to add to their own fund, so that, maybe that's create additional bureaucracy and so on. A third is kind of a middle of the road proposal between those two, which both have merits, is something that would combine automatic direct cash transfer in response to shocks, or even better, in anticipation of shocks. Since we can now predict where big floods or big heating episodes are going to happen, you could pay people at this point. Money could be spent in advance to make sure that everyone in the world is connected via their phone to a pipeline of money. It's been done during COVID, and I think it can be done in a lot of places in the world with some amount of work. So there is an infrastructure for direct cash transfer. We have tons of research from our city showing people do a very good job with it. Artificial intelligence and so on can be used to predict who needs money when. And so this could be with a certain degree of automaticity, getting straight to the people who need help when they need it or before. A second on the mitigation front is to do whatever can be done to avoid things like the Kigali Declaration, to make sure that whenever possible we spend the money to avoid going the wrong path when we know it's the wrong path. And the third one, and that's where I'm pushing for my own parish, and of course Juliette is here and she probably would agree, is to say, well, there is so much we don't know. And in the climate world, the level of evidence is very, very limited. There is a lot of magical thinking about should we do that, we should do that. Like there is very little positive evidence about what can be done in developing countries to protect people, to help them adapt to climate change, to compensate them for loss for climate change. So let these, innovations emerge from the field, test them out locally, so that we have many more tools of things we know work in all 3 dimensions of mitigation, adaptation, compensation. Let me stop here. I think I'm already almost at the end, and we haven't even started the question and answer session. So. But I hope you have a great year and a great PhD and masters and so on, and that as you come back and you change the world. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, chère Esther. Je propose d'ouvrir la discussion, sauf you're free to ask your questions either in French or in English. And Esther will choose if she decides to answer in French or in English or maybe in German, I don't know. So, voilà, j'ouvre la discussion, si possible, avant tout pour les... Monsieur, au fond.
Could you hear me, actually?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, the populists are actively fighting expenditures on climate policy. So doesn't it all kind of depend on the political will and specifically the will of the Americans in this case, and also the Chinese?
First of clarification, I'm not proposing a 15% tax. The 15% tax exists. It's like happening anyways. I'm proposing to add a little bit to it, 3% or 5% to it. So that's a bit less. Second, yes, of course, it depends on political will. But I think it's good to put things. Actually, that's new territory for me to put things like that on the table. But I think it's useful to have them. And I'm actually working on a paper where you will be able to choose your own adventure on how much you think that money should be and what it can be spent on. So citizens can kind of educate themselves. They can still be against it. You know, we have democracies, but they should be against it, knowing what is the state of the world, and most of the time people are not particularly aware of the implication of our behavior on lives of others around the world.
Perhaps see the charts, because they were very interesting. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. D'autres interventions, questions?
Hello, thank you very much for your intervention. I had a question. Do you think that citizens from the richest countries are already convinced that their government should give money to the poorest countries that need money to fight climate change? And if they are not convinced, or if they are, do you think that's a step that government should address before starting to give money to these countries? Thank you.
I doubt they are convinced. Well, actually, there is research done in European countries showing a pretty surprising amount of support. I'm a bit embarrassed because the person who has done this research might be in this room. So if they are, they can step up. Showing, but it's a survey showing that there is actually a great deal of support for a different proposal, which would be a taxation of super high wealth for top income or top wealth to finance both the transition, energy transition, as well as to help poor people in the world. So maybe there is more maybe there is more appetite for it than we think. Traditionally, people tend to not be hugely in favor of helping other countries. People tend to really overestimate how much we're already contributing and underestimating how much this help can be effective. And also the order of magnitudes that we're talking about here are quite different. But I also think the arguments are quite different, because I'm not talking about solidarity or I'm just talking about, you know, the polluter should pay.
D'autres prises de parole?
I think related to your question, I also think it's very important. That's why it's also very important to identify a financing mechanism, as opposed to say, well, France should give that much, and EU should give that much, and US should give that much. So people don't think it's coming right out of their taxes. in the proposal here, it's coming from large corporation who definitely can afford it, or in the proposal that I talked about that's been shopped around among citizens in the EU, it's large fortunes. So maybe that helps also creating a consensus.
Madame, j'ai vu que le micro allait jusqu'à vous.
Hi, sorry. Thanks for the amazing presentation. I was wondering, wouldn't the political instability of many low-income countries and maybe corruption in many governments be an obstacle to an effective redistribution of wealth?
My general response to this is that we should really avoid using corruption in poor countries as an excuse for not doing very much. Besides that, you should change the world. If I have one plea for you is think again every time that's your go-to reaction. Because this is always what you hear. And yes, there is corruption in developing countries. There is plenty of corruption in our countries. And yes, there is corruption in government. There is also plenty of corruption among private companies. So start with that. So that would be my first level reaction. Second is, you're right. And that's why I'm proposing that at least a good part of the money has some automatic feature to it, where there is basically very few people in between, and it's as direct and automatic as possible. So if we have good pipeline and we can press them in a semi-automatic way, that will avoid rent-seeking at various levels of the chain.
Thank you.
Juste à côté.
Merci beaucoup pour la présentation. Vous avez, je trouve, une proposition qui est un peu radicale par rapport au grand champ économique libéral, mais qui ne va pas jusqu'à la radicalité, qui propose de mettre à bas le capitalisme, d'urgence, etc. Et je me demandais si c'était...
Ah oui.
Pardon. Et je me demandais si c'était une conviction personnelle ou si vous pensez qu'il y a une forme de résignation nécessaire dans la recherche et dans le fait de devoir se confronter un peu à la réalité du monde et de devoir proposer des choses qui sont faisables, même si... un besoin de se résigner plutôt que de faire de la recherche en proposant des choses qui nous tiennent à cœur, par exemple. Merci.
So first of all, I don't think that's particularly radical. Again, I'm proposing to increase the minimum corporate tax on large international corporation from 15% to 18%. In France, we're already above that number. So clearly, the economy functions. So I don't think it's a particular radical proposition. I'm not saying it doesn't have practical, issues, but I think it is feasible. Second is, yes, no, that's definitely not about getting rid of capitalism. And that's kind of in keeping with what has been my way of working in general, which is in all of my work, which tends to be more micro-focused, focused on the field, focused on finding solution to concrete problems, is that, while some people are working on the eradication of capitalism or making it better for what matters, in the meantime, there is a lot of things good can be done by focusing on problems here and now. And that's not really about saying that larger issues and conversations shouldn't take place, but it's a bit a matter of personal taste for being more in the weeds of doing something right this minute.
Merci beaucoup. On va prendre, pour ne pas trop déborder et abuser de votre temps, on va prendre encore une question à mon extrême gauche, en l'occurrence.
Maybe not politically. Thank you for the talk. And fortunately, I'm the last one, and I will not ask a question about what you just said. It's because most of us here are maybe starting a master or a doctorate, and it's a position that you've been in some time ago, and some of us could consider that you have an inspiring career. So what would you do if you were at our place today as a researcher? What would you advise us to do? Maybe on you in considering your own preferences in fields and also what is happening right now in science?
Well, you guys are coming from all various fields, so it's I'm not gonna hand out thesis topics. That would be unfair to people that are not in economics. But as a matter of, I'll tell you what I used to tell to PhD students starting writing their dissertation. It's always a pretty scary moment when you kind of launch into the research. And I told them, look, don't think you're writing your Nobel Prize address quite yet. Of course, that has become harder to say, but just for your benefit. You have to take it one day at a time. Maybe it's the same thing again with kind of, that's my personal taste of doing one thing at a time, but just take your first paper, your first work should not be too ambitious. Choose something that interests you, that is a little bit new, but don't listen to the voice in your head that tells you it's already been done, it's obvious, and it's wrong anyway. Just do it. And then go till the end of it, including writing it up, and not asking ChatGPT to write it up. It's incredible how much you will learn in this process of your first paper, of what you're good at, what you're less good at, what interests you, what bores you, what will take more time. Hint, everything. But some will take even more time than others. And then armed with that first experience, you will be in a much better position to do the next project and the next project. And they really, in my experience, students struggle with finding their first project, maybe their second one, and then never again. Because things kind of, one project raise the issues that raise the next project, and so on. And usually this difficulty comes from too much self-criticism at the beginning. So just take your little piece of territory and do it till the end, and then usually you will realize it's much better than you thought it was gonna be.
Merci beaucoup pour cette réponse processuelle à une question abyssale, mais qui me semble être un excellent chemin à suivre pour tous nos étudiants, toutes nos étudiantes ici. Merci beaucoup d'avoir été avec nous dans cette salle surpeuplée. Je crois que j'ai jamais vu un amphi aussi dense à Sciences Po, et ça fait 20 ans que j'y suis, un peu plus même. Donc merci beaucoup à vous. J'invite tous les étudiantes et tous les étudiants à rejoindre les salles où désormais on leur parlera de choses beaucoup plus pédestres, mais néanmoins utiles pour les jours à venir. Merci beaucoup.
Une photo de la promo avec Esther Duflo. Alors venez, est-ce que vous